Hello, everyone. It's a genuine pleasure to be here, albeit virtually, with you today. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for the incredible vision, as well as for the intellectual, political, and artistic commitments that have made this conference possible. And I want to offer a particular shout out to David Kim, who was so kind as to bring me into your ken. While I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in Beirut today in person, I'm very much looking forward to reading and listening and experiencing these conversations at a distance, and I'm grateful to all of you for allowing me to participate from afar. So, I'm going to come at the question of nature and the natural via my own work on bodies, chemical exposure, and estrogen mimicking hormones on an island in the Caribbean. This is a complicated intersection, and I don't have much time to untangle all of it with you, so I'll begin right in the thick of things, at the island's annual celebration of Carnival a couple of years back. Slide, please. There should be a burning Vaval in front of you. On 2013's Mercredi Cendre, or Ash Wednesday, the final day of Carnival in Martinique, throngs of people flocked to the streets of Fort-de-France. Dressed in the traditional mourners' colors of black and white, they massed for the ceremonial burning and funeral for Vaval, the huge papier-mâché effigy that represents the spirit of Carnival on the island. On Mercredi Cendre, on Ash Wednesday, the focus of the celebration shifts to Vaval's effigy, and it also shifts to the big debates of the day. The effigy's creators, through forms of exaggerated parody, craft each year's Vaval as a window onto the issues circulating through popular conversation on the island. Martinique's 2013 Carnival season coincided precipitously with a lively and extended debate in France over the legal status of same-sex relationships. After months of mounting argument both within government circles and without, on Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, France's lower house of parliament passed a bill intended to legalize same-sex marriage and to allow same-sex couples to adopt children. The next day, Martinique's France Antilles, the daily newspaper, announced Vaval's funeral under a headline that played on the slogan of the pro-gay marriage lobby, Mariage pour tous, or Marriage for All, reading Marié pour tous, Vaval est mort. Married for all, Vaval is dead. As is tradition, Vaval's obsèques, or his funeral obituaries, were announced on local radio stations and in the newspapers like so. And please change the slide. This year the people discovered, instead of a man, a type of Macume, His Majesty Vaval, the king of masturbation, of uranism, of sodomy and of uranism, who leaves at his death a long line of children created through artificial reproductive technologies. So Macume is a Creole colloquialism, sometimes spelled a bit differently from what you see here, that translates roughly to mean faggot or bati-boy in Anglophone Caribbean slang. Most people who are called Macume do not self-identify as such. Rather, it's a charge levied at a range of men whose degrees of feminine presentation give others pause. Most of my male interlocutors have spoken of their fears of being interpolated as Macume, something that can happen should they display a passing limpness in the wrist, a mode of speaking that is coded as female, or a manner of dress that does not conform to the style of the times for heterosexual men. Many of the same-sex loving men with whom I have worked recount that as young boys, they carefully monitored their own comportment for fear that an insufficiently masculine performance would provoke this charge. While this is an insult slung at gender-transgressing men throughout the year, the figure is given a particular visibility during Carnival, when cisgendered men dress up in parody of travesti macume during the various défilés that are part of the celebration. So if you could change the slide here for one example, and if you could change the slide again for another example, this one including the mayor of Fort-de-France. 2013's Vaval, as his funeral announcement suggested, was a 12-foot-tall macume, or rather a pair of macume, walking arm in arm down the aisle to Mary. So if you could change the slide here, that would be wonderful. So a conventional read of this Vaval might focus on the materiality of the effigy's figures, their exaggerated parody of masculine and feminine markers, their beards and makeup, the visible penises in their panties, their nail polish and high heels. A conventional read might highlight that the characters wore briefs that said coupé on one side and fion on the other, revealing the dense semiotic field within which they circulated. In Creole, coupéfiant means, quite literally, and do forgive me, to fuck in the ass. But orally, the words sounded similar to the names Jean-François Copé and François Fillon, who waged a public political battle in 2012, mostly over the question of gay marriage. Finally, the word couper, or to cut in Creole, sat on the makume's crotches, enacting these figures' symbolic neutering. A conventional read might focus on the bottle of champagne in the effigy's hand, calling up the fact that Martinique is the largest importer of champagne in the Western Hemisphere, true fact, something that inspires many to conclude that the island suffers from a crisis of surconsommation, or overconsumption. A conventional read might focus on the apocalyptic slogan on that champagne bottle, reading Le fin d'un monde, or the end of a world, highlighting its temporal dimension, and that ideas about same-sex marriage are central to debates about the end times, both in the Caribbean and in Europe. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to draw your attention to another dimension of the image, the champagne glass in the effigy's hand, the black one, labeled Chlordécone. So chlordécone, conventionally spelled in the French as Chlordécone, was a pesticide used on Martinique and Guadeloupe's banana plantations from the 1970s through 1993. Slide, please. In 2007, Martinican intellectuals Raphaël Confiant and Louis Boutrin published a scandalous exposé, Chronique d'un empoisonnement annoncé, or Chronicle of a Poisoning Foretold, an account in which they charged that chlordécone had irreversibly poisoned the island's soils and sources of potable water, and the full story is available in my case briefing for this conference. The book was a #1 bestseller in local bookstores that year, and while the chronicle's tone was wildly polemical, its message inspired serious, measured reflection about levels of pesticide contamination in both Martinique and Guadeloupe. So it's no secret by now that we live in a chemical sea, and that synthetic pesticides have polluted lands and aquifers on every continent. When Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962, she sounded a public and powerful alarm about the dangers of DDT and other chemicals accumulating in the environment. Confiant and Boutrin's Chronicle of a Poisoning Foretold did similar narrative work, but their intervention revealed how the politics of this social problem take on a unique dimension in the French Antilles. While Martinique and Guadeloupe are located in the Caribbean Sea, flanked by independent small island states like St. Lucia and Dominica, they are also fully incorporated French territories and members of the European Union. By a 1946 government decree, long fought for by their political leadership, these islands became French départements, an historic process that, at least on paper, made them equal in status to places like Provence or Brittany. But over 75 years later, residents of these territories continue to grapple with the structural precarity of being designated French citizens de l'outre-mer, or of the outer seas, told that they are just like the French de l'Hexagone, or of the mainland, but made to struggle to attain that parity in both symbolic and practical terms. This struggle for parity was thrown into high relief with the publication of Confiant and Boutrin's exhortation about a poisoning foretold. So chlordécone, this pesticide's usage, was halted in the U.S. and in most of Western Europe in the middle of the 1970s, but it took until the 1990s for the French government to rescind licenses for its use in the Antilles. As in other instances when the islands have been treated as exceptions to a broader French rule, citizens of the mainland were deliberately protected from this class of chemicals, while their counterparts in l'outre-mer were not. Like DDT, chlordécone is an internationally recognized carcinogen, and its presence in contaminated soils and foods has been linked to both male infertility and to prostate cancer. Of the two islands, Martinique has been the site of the most widespread use, contamination, and controversy about chlordécone in the region. Slide, please. And if you could just take a look at the top of the slide, that's the box of interest. According to the World Cancer Research Fund, as recently as 2012, Martinique was listed as having the highest rate of prostate cancer in the world, a statistic that many see as being linked to chemical pollution. Chlordécone, this chemical, is also understood to be an endocrine disruptor, a compound that generates estrogen-like hormones in the environment and consequently in people's bodies. Given that effect, chlordécone has been the object of an emergent gender and sexual politic on the island, where local suspicions about the contamination's relationship to male effeminacy, as you see in the Vaval of 2013, also include new convictions about what some are calling a genocide by sterilization, and initiatives now at the local hospital to document sex variation and intersex births. While very little scientific research has been done on environmental contamination's relationship to human endocrine disruption, much more has actually been done on amphibians, like in the work of biologist Tyrone Hayes or ecologist David Skelly. Sociologist Celia Roberts evokes the kinds of fears that environmental estrogens inspire in academic and non-academic discourses alike. She writes, "Globally today, there is something suspicious in the water, in the air, and in the ground that is producing change in human and non-human biological systems. Chemicals that act like estrogens are repeatedly named as culprits. Reports of rising infertility in both sexes, of increasing incidence of reproductive cancers in humans, of reproductive system birth defects in children, of tiny penises in alligators, of lesbian gulls and intersex fish, all litter the pages of both scientific journals and the mass media." Thinking through the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals in human bodies, Roberts asks how feminist scholars might think about what these chemicals do without essentializing ideas about sex, gender, or reproduction. In my own work, I am concerned with how we can take anxieties about environmental estrogen seriously, about this disruption of the natural seriously, while also refusing a retrenchment into heteronormative fantasies about normal and natural bodies. While the contamination in Martinique activates residents' fears about the porosity of the body's boundaries, it also affords us an important opportunity to think flexibly about bodies, about what they are made of, and about what their biology might mean. You could do slide, please. So you should see a body there. Body burden is a term used for the past half century by mostly Anglophone toxicologists to describe the accumulated amount of harmful substances present in a human or a non-human body. So as an example, this is an image from the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, an activist organization committed to reducing the effect of e-waste on Northern California's soil and bodily ecologies. I'm offering up this image as an example of things that are identified as contributors to body burden, like mercury, like selenium, like barium, like PCBs, like pesticides. The book that I'm currently writing is called Body Burdens, Toxic Endurance and Decolonial Desire in the French Atlantic. Taking Martinique's chlordécone contamination as a point of departure, but thinking outward from that chemical to other forms of material and immaterial toxicity, in my research I have been reworking the idea of body burden to account for the ways that New World bodies, post-slavery bodies, Black bodies remain inextricably entangled with the forces of capital, disproportionately porous in the face of exposure to and penetration by both toxic materials and toxic discourses. In my work, I ask how we might use chlordécone as a tracing device for the elaboration of a corporeal as well as a territorial record of colonial and post-colonial violence, thinking human bodies in critical relationship to bodies of land and bodies of water. While body burden's original meaning draws from a scientific definition of contamination, in my work I argue that body burdens are at once metaphorical and material, imagined and embodied. Slide, please. Those of us who work in the Caribbean have long been thinking about the kinds of unnatural, quote-unquote, unnatural burdens that a body might bear, have documented and theorized what Caribbean bodies have been forced to carry, and have been thinking through the effects of the things that accumulate or accrete in the spaces through which we move and in the spaces beneath our skin. These enduring toxicities remind Caribbean people that the plantation past is not just past, rather that it lives on in the economic systems that continue to rely upon this mode of production, that this history leaves its traces in the soils, and that it remains in the pesticides that agricultural industries employ, chemicals that are changing our bodies as well as our ideas about what our bodies are made of. In Martinique, the chlordécone contamination is a very real reminder of the burdens that our bodies carry, a reminder that forces people on the island to question what it might mean to be truly decolonized, not just in their minds or on their soils, but also in their bodies. Thank you.